Two motorcycles flew down the highway on a crisp but comfortable Saturday night. On them were two teenage boys and their girlfriends, and as they wound down the roads towards their destination, the girls' smiles were wide and their hair flew freely behind them. The boys driving the bikes felt on top of the world and in complete control of the weekend. The bikes beneath them fed into their energy and excitement as they approached the lake and then rolled to a stop. What started as a simple night of camping and fishing and being with good friends would turn tragic as the summer sun began to rise. For in the morning, this simple night would lead to the most infamous unsolved murders in Finnish history. Welcome back to Tragedy with a View. I am your host, Kayla, and here we are with another free solo episode, and today we are talking about the Lake Bodom murders. Lake Bodom in Espoo, Finland is located near the very southern tip of the country. Lake Bodom is surrounded by perfectly groomed pine trees, and many love the lake for fishing and swimming in the summer months. The area is known for calm waters and peaceful ambience. The lake is about 1 kilometer wide and 3 kilometers long, or 0.62 miles wide and 1.8 miles long. And while the area is surrounded by foliage and nature, the lake is not very far from civilization. So close, in fact, that locals make a split-second decision to stay and camp at the lake or go home. And it was an area that was pretty well frequented by campers, fishers, swimmers, boaters, hikers. You get the picture. While I saw notes of this place being unsafe, that just does not seem to ring true to me based on the fact that it was such a popular area for people to easily go and explore the outdoors and enjoy nature. On Saturday, June 4th, 1960, two teenage couples decided they were going to go camp at this very location. Mila Ermeli Bjorklund and Anya Tulikki-Makai were very best friends and were both 15, and they were dating 18-year-olds Seppo Bosman and Nils Gustafsson. To be clear, Mila was dating Nils, and Anya was dating Seppo. Seppo and Nils were also friends, and so this group decided to go camping as their summer was kicking off. They arrived at the lake as the sun was getting low, so they set up their camp and spent some time fishing and just having a grand teenage camping trip. The couples were happy and thrilled to be out together unsupervised. They had set up their tent about halfway between the road and the water, so not super close, but also not super far from either. The girls were giddy and the boys were smiling and laughing along with them. As the day transitioned into night, they watched as people left the area, and Mila and Anya went into the tent to settle down for the night. Seppo and Nils, however, stayed up drinking and fishing, and finally around 2 a.m., they went into their tent and they settled down for the night as well. None of them went to sleep with even the slightest idea that their lives were about to end. The following morning on June 5th, which was a Sunday, around 6 a.m., the sun slowly rose and people began to come to the lake. Two boys by the name of Heikki Salonen and Kalevi Halalinen were bird watching, and they noticed a collapsed tent near the lake and a man walking away from what appeared to be the tent's direction. And it is unclear to me if they were using binoculars to look at this guy or if they were just observing him and noticed him. But the man had blonde hair and he was wearing dark pants and a light shirt that either buttoned or zipped up the front. I can't imagine that they had been looking through binoculars at the tent, because the scene about to unfold was a gruesome one. Besides them, Martin and Ruth Coley were out on the water rowing with their daughter when they saw the tent around 7 a.m. From what they could see, they thought that the campers had been in a fight and decided that they didn't want to go investigate because they had their young daughter with them. It was not until about 11 a.m. that the reason for that apparent fight became clear. When Esko Oiva, a carpenter who was jogging to the lake to go for a swim, went by the tent, he noticed that stuff was everywhere. And then he noticed the pile the tent was in, with two bodies seemingly scrambled together on top. And then one of the bodies took a sharp breath in. Esko had accidentally stumbled across the scene of all four teenagers violently beaten. When investigators arrived around noon, they found the scene was more gruesome than they had expected. It was clear that they had initially been attacked from the outside of the tent, and then Mila and Nils were pulled from the tent and laid on top. Or they escaped from the tent and that's where they fell. Inside the tent, Seppo was found with his legs under Anya's body. He had bruises on his knuckle and his left temple was busted in. He had a broken jaw and he also had a deep puncture from a knife on his neck. Anya was found with her head under a blanket, and in addition to the blunt force trauma wounds to her head and neck, she also had stab wounds on her back. The tent was in shreds from the slash marks of a knife, further proving that a person attacked these four from outside of the tent, and investigators were able to determine that the attacks occurred sometime around 4 to 6 a.m. From the injuries, they could see that they had been attacked with what looked to be a rock due to the blunt force trauma injuries, as well as stab wounds from a knife. Reportedly, the wounds were mostly on their heads and necks, which would lead me to believe that this person knew which way these teenagers were laying. In addition to this, all of them had defensive wounds. Mila, Seppo, and Anya had all died from their injuries, but Nils was alive. Mila, unfortunately, was the most brutally attacked, and then after she ended up on top of the tent, her bottoms were removed, indicating that she may have been sexually assaulted. She had also been stabbed several more times after she died, and this could tell us that the attack was either maybe targeted at her, or maybe she fought back enough that the attacker took out their rage on her. Nils was found to have fractured bones in his face, the worst being his jaw, and he had a concussion, which explains why he couldn't remember anything about that night. He hadn't even been aware that his friends and girlfriend had been killed, but he would later provide a clue to the killer. They were dressed in black and bright red, which is different than what the two bird watchers had said that they saw the man leaving the area was wearing. But interestingly, I actually saw a couple of sources that said that he specifically saw bright red eyes. So that also leaves some questions as to how valid that information was, or if this was a result from his concussion. As investigators tried to take in every detail they could, they found some things were taken from the tent. For example, Seppo's leather jacket. The keys to the motorcycle were gone, but the motorcycles were still parked nearby. This might indicate that the attacker knew that he left one, or maybe at the time of their leaving the area, more than one of the teenagers were still alive. There might have been the consideration that if they took the keys, the teens who were still alive would not be able to either go after them or go to a hospital for help, because after all, the best way to get away with a crime, especially in 1960, is to leave no witnesses, no survivors. Other items that were stolen included Nils' shoes, other clothing, and money from their wallets. So the police would make some vital mistakes in their investigation. For example, they did not block off the area, and as news spread, people began to come to the scene along with the police, and this contaminated pretty much everything. In addition to this, the police did not photograph, write down, draw a photo of the crime scene, or do anything to preserve where they found what. Mila, while it seemed pretty likely that she had been raped at some point in this attack, did not have any evidence recovered from her body. To be more clear, police never took any biological samples from her body, meaning that any semen that might have been left on or in her was not collected, and therefore there was no DNA or potential DNA recovered from her body of the attacker. Further, they called in reinforcements to help comb through the area to look for clues and the missing items that might lead to some sort of explanation to who did this, but they didn't set up any sort of search or grid system to search for these items, most of which were never located. Nils' shoes were found about 500 meters away. They were partially buried near a bush, which might indicate that whoever committed this crime was in a rush. After all, these murders occurred in the early morning hours, and the lake was a popular area for people to flock to. It is no surprise that the rush was meant to try to cover their own tracks. This also might indicate that the attacker did not pre-plan their attack. Without a plan and the sun starting to peek up over the horizon, there was likely some panic before they left the area. Because of the police's incompetence at securing the scene and not having a process to best lead to suspects, the actual cause of death for each person was never discovered, and the weapons used were never identified or found. So we can likely guess that their deaths were a result from either blunt force trauma, blood loss, something along those lines, but not having a timeline for who died when did not help investigators in piecing together what exactly happened here. However, the Finnish army arrived to search the area for clues, which is a big deal. The Finnish army is well trained and well equipped to handle the search for evidence, and they did not arrive until after citizens had already kind of showed up to the scene and started contaminating things, which is, again, a big problem. As the Finnish army meticulously combed through the forest and dredged the lake, their hope for discovering something began to wane. Even they could not find the additional missing clothing, the wallets, or any clues that might help to identify who did this to these 4 teens. With the lack of evidence and poor police investigation, police have struggled to connect anyone to the crimes enough to be able to get a conviction. But they do have some potential theories and potential suspects. Starting with Carl Vladimir Gillström, police had received multiple complaints over the years from campers that he was violent towards them, but no one had actually been injured from him. Carl was considered to be mentally unstable and would cut down tents he found near the lake. He would also throw rocks at people when they were walking down the street he lived on. And some even claim that they watched him return to the scene of the murders, but they were scared that he would come after them, so they never called the police. In addition to this, Carl admitted to a neighbor that he did commit this crime while they were drinking together one night. But Carl would later claim that he never said that. Days after the murders were committed, Carl was observed pouring concrete into a well that he had in his garden that was in his yard, and many believe that this is where he hid the murder weapon. Police, however, while they did investigate this idea, they never truly investigated the well. Carl's wife, though, would originally state that Carl had been in bed all night with her on the night of June 4th to 5th, giving him an alibi. But then, years later, she would retract that statement, saying that Carl threatened to kill her if she didn't cover for him. However, shortly after the murders, Carl had been photographed, and in this photograph, he is shirtless. Now, this is a really key piece of information because, as we know, all of those teenagers had defensive wounds. They fought back for their lives, and that would leave a mark on the attacker, or you would think it would leave a mark on the attacker. In this photo, Carl did not have any injuries. There was no scrapes, no bruising, no marks at all to indicate that he had gotten in a fight with anyone. Nonetheless, Carl committed suicide 9 years later in 1969 by drowning in Lake Bodom. And while Carl was a potential, most of the public had their eyes on Hans Osman as the man who committed these murders. Hans was born in Germany but was a Finnish citizen, and he lived near Lake Bodom. The public would think this because some odd situations would result from where he was. In fact, there were 5 cases where Hans was a person of interest in, and in the late 1990s, on his deathbed, he would confess to one of them. But that one was not the Lake Bodom murders. Hans was reportedly a KGB spy and potentially a former Nazi, and the morning of the murders, he would arrive at the Helsinki hospital, and he was incoherent. He couldn't form sentences, his clothing appeared to have been covered in blood, and his hands and fingernails were extremely dirty. He was trying to be seen faster, and so he pretended to faint at one point. And when the doctor tickled him and he had a reaction to being tickled, he started getting angry towards the staff and other patients because they were being seen before him. And when they realized that Hans wasn't really injured or sick or in need of emergent medical care, they told him to leave. However, they never grabbed any of his clothing that seemed to have blood on it, so they could never confirm that it actually was blood or whose blood it was. So besides this, the group of birdwatchers told investigators that they saw a blonde man leaving the scene of the murders, and Hans had blonde hair. Besides his behavior being very weird around this time, he lived near the lake. He had, again, blonde hair, which he shaved after that information was revealed to the public, and his clothing that he wore to the hospital matched the clothing that the birdwatchers gave to investigators, which included the light shirt or jacket that closed up the front and dark pants. This description of clothing, though, contradicts, again, what Nils said he saw the attacker wearing. In addition to this, Hans had been having an affair, and when his mistress was contacted, she confirmed that she had been with Hans the entire night, and even more, this was confirmed by her brother, who was also staying with her at her house. The next person of interest is a little maybe out there, maybe not. Pentti Sionits, who was a known violent criminal, was the first true suspect that the police had, and Pentti even admitted to a cellmate while he was incarcerated in the mid-1960s that he was the one who killed the three and left Nils to die. However, there was some pause given to this due to the fact that Pentti would have only been 14 years old at the time of the murders, and they believed that he would not have been able to overpower the four older teenagers, especially with two 18-year-olds. And it seems odd to me that they would immediately discount him because of his age when he was a known violent criminal and he had a record at the age of 14. So even though he was dismissed, and in this particular case anyways, and then later incarcerated, Pentti would also die by suicide the day after the 9th anniversary, so June 6th, 1969, by hanging himself. This is the same year that Carl committed suicide by drowning in Lake Bodom. Now, I want to insert in here real quick something that I didn't see very much of, and I guess it's kind of my final theory. So we have Carl, who admitted to the crime and then committed suicide, and we have Pentti, who admitted to committing the crime and then committed suicide, both of them the same year. And while I have not seen this theory be discussed very much, I am sure it is on the minds of those who looked into this case, and hopefully at least it was taken into consideration that this crime was not committed by one person. Of course, it is more comfortable to blame one person and for that one person to either end up in jail or dead, which some of the suspected killers are there. But the potential for this to have been accomplished by two people, I don't think can be dismissed. To me, it is glaringly obvious that these teens fought back, and Nils and Mila potentially put up the biggest fights, first escaping from the interior of the tent, and then with Mila having the most brutal wounds. To me, this leads me to believe that two people may have descended upon the tents at the same time, violently bashing through the walls before Nils and Mila escaped and began to fight back. Nils, however, was bashed on the head, hard enough to knock him out, but not hard enough to kill him, and in a fit of rage, these two attackers were finding it difficult to overcome the teens, and they took their anger out on Mila, who refused to back down. But this doesn't really fit well either with the rush and decidedly unpremeditated attack. Two people on the same page for the same attack and both getting away with it for decades seems unlikely. Unless those two people met spontaneously, had the same anger for one for just people in general and the other for campers and hikers in and near this lake, and they had a spontaneous conversation that led to this attack, and then they were separated and committed suicide at around the same time. It's just a theory, purely just a theory, but one that I think should have been looked at a little closer if it hadn't. Then, of course, Nils, the survivor, would 44 years after the murders be arrested for the murders of Mila, Anya, and Seppo. Based on DNA evidence, they found blood from the three who died on Nils' shoes, along with no blood inside of the shoes. Their stance became that the killer had to have been wearing Nils' shoes and then ditched them prior to attacking Nils because Nils' blood was not on the shoes. This was further confirmed by the fact that there were bloody fingerprints on the shoes, indicating that they had been worn during the attacks and then removed after the killer got blood on his or her hands. Unfortunately, that blood had kind of soaked into the fabric of the shoes, making it impossible to pull a fingerprint from. To add to this, it didn't help that Nils had blonde hair. To explain, they further theorized that Nils likely had been intoxicated and became angry at Mila for some reason and attacked her. She was the one who suffered the most violent attack and the only one to be sexually assaulted. Nils then attacked Anya and Seppo to eliminate witnesses and then left the scene with the motorcycle keys, money, and a clean set of clothes to change into. At some point, he must have decided that abandoning the scene would lead to many questions and clearly lead to him. So, he somehow got rid of the other items that he stole from the tent, saw he had blood on his shoes, so he tried to abandon those as well, stabbed himself, hit his own face with a rock, and returned to the scene and waited to be discovered. The trial for this started on August 4th, 2005, and while he was originally found guilty and sentenced to life in prison, in October of that same year, the court exonerated Nils. They just couldn't see teenage jealousy causing someone to become this violent. And while I agree that this explanation makes the most sense, there's also potential that Nils had actually left the tents, maybe because he had been drinking and maybe he'd been drinking a lot, and so he left to quote unquote use the bathroom, or maybe he needed to throw up, and he came back to the tent as his girlfriend and friends were being attacked. I don't know. That explanation also leaves me with questions. It provides maybe some answers, but it leaves also some questions. There is then one last unknown suspect. Shortly after the murders, Nils agreed to undergo hypnosis because he had seen the person who attacked them, and while under hypnosis, he was able to provide a description of what the attacker looked like. Now, hypnosis is highly questioned, and there's a lot of nuance and wiggle room when it comes to hypnosis, purely because you can put thoughts into someone's mind and that's what they will roll with rather than their own memories or their own truth. So the man that Nils described had a large forehead with a square-shaped face, wide eyes, large lips, and a very strong jaw. And then, at some point later that year, someone was looking through the photographs taken during the funerals and noticed a man who looked just like the drawings standing in the crowd. One little tidbit of information that I neglected to share at the appropriate time is that there was a piece of fabric found outside of the tent. Some sources say it was a towel, others called it a pillowcase, but no matter, the police did do one thing right in collecting and preserving this cloth. Years later, when DNA technology improved, they were able to pull DNA from the cloth, finding Mila's DNA and the DNA from a fifth person. This DNA has not been matched to any of the suspects they originally had, except for Carl. They have been using family members to match DNA or dismiss that there would be a match in the DNA, and Carl's son denies to allow the test to be done. But this still shows that there was a fifth person potentially involved, especially with the fact that Mila appears to have been sexually assaulted. She was naked from the waist down, which I think I want to circle back real quick to that this takes away from the rush or the implication that whoever did this attack did so really quickly and then abandoned the area. It also makes me wonder if she was raped or sexually assaulted. Sex is a messy process. I mean, even sexual acts that is not purely intercourse is kind of a messy process. And it makes me wonder if or how this attacker wouldn't have ended up with even more blood just kind of smeared on themselves. Because first, they have these violent attacks where blood and body fluids are spraying as a result of these poor teenagers being bludgeoned. And of course, to me, being on the outside of this, it would seem impossible for someone to be able to walk away from the scene without it being clear that they had been involved in a brutal beating. There are many unanswered questions to this case. There are also many conclusions that can be drawn to this case. For decades, these murders have weighed heavily on the families and locals. Some have even begun to refer to the attackers as phantom, someone who will attack children if they don't behave while they are on the banks of the lake. And while I don't love the lore of the unexplained, the truth of the matter is that these murders may never have an answer. The locals and those interested in unsolved cases and piecing the puzzle together may never know who did this. And after 65 years, many of the families and friends of the victims, suspects, police and investigators, locals and witnesses have passed away. So the chances of having anything conclusive coming from their deaths is small. But stranger things have happened. Thank you so much for listening. And everyone, please take a moment to leave a review. That really helps out with all things algorithm podcasty wise. And if you're interested, be sure to subscribe on either Apple, Spotify, or Patreon for access to the subscriber-only episodes that come out the first Wednesday of each month. Beyond that, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and we will talk next week. What is life without close calls with disaster? Thank you for listening. Don't forget to follow the podcast to be the first to hear the now weekly episodes. Join our subscription on Patreon, Apple, or Spotify today and immerse yourself in the haunting beauty of the great outdoors. For around $4 a month, you'll get exclusive access to the first episode of each month and early access to all other episodes, showcasing the morbid and mysterious side of nature. Please reach out with story requests, and if you have your own story, please email tragedywithaview@gmail.com for a chance to have your story featured on a later episode. Again, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.